Shall I begin, Sangamita?
Yes, please.
And do I need to be pinned, or are we not worrying? Does the speaker view do that automatically?
I've already pinned you.
Oh, great. Okay. Are you sure? Under my little thing, it says I still have the option of pinning.
Well, I clicked on it, and it says on your picture, remove pin, so that,
Oh, you're good. You're good then. Yeah, sorry. It's good. Okay. Great. Thank you. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Sangamita, I did just think, sorry. I think I think pin might just be for you. I think spotlight puts me in for everyone. Um, which might be significant because if it is recording, that'll make sure that my picture's actually up instead of switching back and forth. I think.
well, it's always worked for me before, but I am not a techie person, so I'll bow to your superior technological expertise.
It shouldn't hurt it at all. So here, that should work. We've had this issue on Zoom calls before where another person wasn't muted and it sort of switched back and forth if one person wasn't spotlighted. So I hope that's all right. If you mute, it should be okay either way. So sorry for the interruption. Okay, so with that caveat, so it's nice to have everyone here for the retreat. We decided that a good subject for this retreat would be Yoniso Manasikara, which means wise attention. And there's a list that the Buddha gives called the Dawnings of the Dhamma, which it's in the Samyutta Nikaya, the connected discourses. And basically, he describes a list of qualities which serve as a ground and a herald of the Noble Eightfold Path, saying that just as the dawn illuminates the land before the sun rises, even so, these qualities precede the Noble Eightfold Path. And then he outlines several, including and beginning with appropriate or wise attention, Yoniso Manasikara. And the others on the list include things like Kalyanamitta, spiritual friendship, and others, all of which share this quality of being something that one can easily look to cultivate. They aren't necessarily refined, or they're refined, but they aren't abstract qualities, say like equanimity or rapture. They're basic foundations of the practice which one can begin with. And appropriate attention has this quality. It's the most basic act of karma that one can create. And when the Buddha speaks about feeding or starving the bright and dark qualities of the mind, which are most fundamentally divided into the 7 factors of awakening, which are qualities like mindfulness, energy, rapture, tranquility, concentration, equipoise, or the hindrances, which are the dark and obstructive qualities in the mind to meditation and to calm and to insight, such as sensual desire, ill will, sloth and drowsiness, restlessness and remorse, or skeptical doubt. He says that this quality of appropriate attention, Yoniso Manasikara, is the food, the foundation, the nutriment for these bright and dark qualities. Or rather, unwise attention is the nutriment for the dark qualities, the hindrances. Wise attention is the nutriment for the bright qualities, the bojjhanga, or the awakening factors. And this is significant in a way that such an academic description doesn't do justice to. The term Yoniso Manasikara, wise attention, is a compound of several words. So manas is the term for intellect. Kara means action. So action of the intellect, manasikara, is attention. And the Buddha compares manas, the intellect, to the fingers, or sorry, rather, this is an analogy that comes up in the commentaries. So the intellect is composed of the pinky finger, which is in this case feeling, Vedana, the affective qualities of experience, the signet finger, which is perception, what we name our experience or things that we experience. And that's significant because once something is named and categorized, perception, which is the signet finger, binds us to it. Intention is the middle finger, which in most cultures is the pointer finger. It's the broadest, most prominent of the fingers. The pointer finger, I believe, is contact. And the thumb, I believe that actually, the thumb is attention in this case, in this analogy. And there's 2 different analogies around the hand, but I think the most useful one here is to look at the full scope of all these qualities of intellect. Attention are what go out and grasp objects, and then they press it into the palm, which is the heart, or chitta, the heart mind. It's the subjective quality of experience. It's much nearer to us. It's what intends and what yearns and what is ignorant and becomes awakened. So manasikara, this act of attention, is the grasping of objects in our world and experience and pressing them into the palm to taste, to experience. Yoniso, which is the word before manasikara, is etymologically related to the word for yoni, which is womb. So Yoniso Manasikara is attention that goes to the core of things. But it's more. because in a sense, what we give attention to is what births our world. And the world we live in is largely dependent upon where we steer our attention. And this is significant because the world we live in this sense, determines who we are or what our heart's quality is. And there's a term or a saying that I have repeated before, but that I think is very important, by Hegel, where he states that evil lies in the gaze that sees evil all around. And so where most of us move through the world before practice, believing that the world we live in is dependent upon the external conditions to an extent that we find ourselves in. And our reactions and subjective experience are largely dependent upon that world. The most significant step in this Buddhist path, or at least the dawning of this path, the beginning, is to understand that we, through the tools that the Buddhists gave us, can carefully and intentionally direct our attention and determine the world we live in, and therefore determine the qualities of our own hearts. In this sense, Yoniso Manasikara is our ability to give birth to a world that is bright and loving, and therefore to give rise to a heart which is those same things. There's a few examples I've brought up before around this. One is, my returning to the US on election night, and just finding the people I met utterly changed, in a sense where the constant attention to the 24-hour news cycle and the worry over the political movement in the US had, even though people's day-to-day lives had not changed really, had very much changed the world that people lived in since I'd been in the US several years earlier. And so many people had forgotten, not that you want to ignore the bigger issues in the world, but to see how much people had forgotten the bright garden their hands worked in, for these headlines, and how not just their world, but their own hearts had darkened from that. It was very visible. The other example I think worthy of bringing to mind is Longpo Pasano was speaking a while ago. I'm working on his biography, so I get a lot of good stories from him. And he was put into a position of leadership at Wat Pananachat, the international monastery in Thailand, when he was 7 rains retreats, when he'd been a monk for 7 years, because Ajahn Chah got sick and needed someone new to take over. And I don't think he was terribly thrilled about this development, but his devotion to his teacher meant he took it on. I once asked why he'd remained abbot after that for so long, and he's like, well, Ajahn Chah made me abbot, and then he kind of got sick and stopped being able to talk, so I just had to stay abbot. So he took it on with a lot of care, and yet, Wat Pananachat is notorious for, you've got, 20 different nationalities all mixed in. The villagers at the monastery, or at the village that they moved into, were very skeptical about the whole enterprise. a monk at a nearby monastery was like putting up posters, sort of questioning the monks there. And Ajahn Pasano got a chance several years in to go visit Amaravati in England, or sorry, Chithurst in England, where Ajahn Sumedho was setting up a monastery, and recounts how it was, it got there and it was this beautiful community that was so running smoothly, and things were exciting and new. And so then he had to return to Thailand and just kind of depressed. And on his way back to Nanachat, Wat Pa Nanachat, he visited a small monastery in Bangkok called, run by P.A.P. Yuto, a venerable and esteemed scholar monk. And Ajahn Pasano went back to meet him. He lived in the back of this monastery, which was, in the middle of Bangkok, sort of run down, frequented by tourists. And he went back and found this monk, Venerable Pito, living in this little hut in the back, and was just moved by how Venerable Pito was utterly happy, just untouched by the conditions around him. And Longpo Pasano thought to himself, if this monk can find happiness here, what do I have to complain about, living in the forest out there? And that determined the tenor of his next years at Nanachat. Another monk named Ajahn Dun initially made his monastery in the outskirts of Surin, before the city kind of encompassed his forest monastery, and it was surrounded by, shops and the smell of cooking meat all the time. And it was a theme that monks would come there and get annoyed and say they couldn't practice. And Ajahn Dun didn't have much sympathy for them. He said, when they came and said, look, it's too noisy here, there's all these lights, there's karaoke. There's always karaoke in Thailand. Ajahn Dun would turn to them and say, why do you give attention to these things? It's the nature of light to be bright. It's the nature of noise to be loud. Why do you give attention to these things? Focus on your practice. And Ajahn Chah said, why do you go out and bother the sound? The sound isn't bothering you, you're going out and bothering it. And this was funny coming from Wat Mapjan, where I ordained, where there's constant construction and a large pack of dogs that likes to howl in the mornings for meditation and chanting, and to come back to the West, where people would get quite annoyed if the person next to them was breathing too loudly at meditation. So appropriate attention truly can change our world, not just in these small ways, but to, a great extent. I just watched Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama's documentary on the Book of Joy, where the Dalai Lama recounts again the story of his a Lama he was good friends with, who came away from 18 years of imprisonment and torture by the Chinese, saying that he narrowly avoided danger. And when the Dalai Lama asked what danger he'd avoided, he said that the danger of losing love for his captors, but that he didn't lose that in the end. And the fact that you can be, even in a circumstance that brutal, and the thing you give attention to is your own quality of love and compassion. How much more proof do we need that attention is what can determine our world? And through determining our world, determine who we are and our trajectory. So this same monk, P.A.P. Yuto, the scholar monk that Ajahn Pasano visited, when I was living with Ajahn Jayasaro would go visit this monk maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks. And P.A. Piyuto had written a book called Buddha Dhamma. And when I asked Longpo Pasno and Ajahn Jayasara what the one book they would take to a desert island would be, they said it was this book, Buddha Dhamma. And in it, P.A. Piyuto outlines 10 different uses of appropriate attention that we find in the canon. So the first is analyzing things by causes and conditions. The second is analyzing things into component parts. The third is analyzing things in terms of the three characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and not self. The fourth is analyzing things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. The fifth is analyzing phenomena in terms of their, the connection between practices and their underlying principles. The next, I think the sixth, is analyzing things in terms of their true and false benefit. The seventh is analyzing phenomena in terms of the drawback, the advantage, and the escape. The next is analyzing things in a way to arouse wholesome mental states. The next is analyzing things in terms of remaining in the present moment. And the final is using appropriate attention in the service of analytical conversation, which is conversation dealing with any of the previous 9. So that's a lot. I think this is a good framework, and will be plenty to talk about over the next few talks today. This first use of appropriate attention, of analyzing phenomena in terms of causes and conditions, is one of my favorite to reflect on. The Buddha said that present moment experience is composed of the fruits of past intention and our current intention and the fruits of our current intention. So that's confusing, but what it basically amounts to is that it's a complex system. What we find our experience composed of is made of a complex series and swirling vortex of conditions. The world around us is constantly shifting. And in a sense, this is the core insight of Buddhism, is that we are surrounded by a shifting and unstable wealth and sea of conditions. And when we see that this system is a chaotic system, we understand that it has 2 salient qualities. One is scale invariance, which means that patterns that manifest on a very small level also manifest on a very large or higher level. So this is like a Mandelbrot set, if you've seen that, fractals, where you look at the picture in a small aspect and can watch it and see that it's the same pattern on a large scale. And what this means is that these karmic patterns we see in our lives on the small scale of meditation also manifest on a broad scale. So this is the importance of meditation, is we get to see these patterns of suffering and pain and unskillfulness play out in a microcosm of our sit. So you see how, and then we see how that same pattern happens to be the pattern that dominates our whole life. So you see how you control the breath with a overwhelmingly tight grip and an aggression, and how you berate yourself whenever you lose the thread of meditation. And suddenly you realize that how you control the breath is exactly how you're trying to control your child or your career or your world in general or your spouse. Or you see how you berate yourself when you lose the breath is exactly how you're berating your loved one or your employee or yourself on a larger scale. You see how the constant little fantasies you bring to mind when you meditate are that distraction is the same way you distract yourself in your daily life, constantly looking for some way to avoid facing quiet and the shadow and your own suffering. So you see these things play out in a small and controlled environment, and then you alter them in that small controlled environment. You gentle your intention. You bring loving kindness. You learn to handle the breath with delicacy and to redirect yourself back to the breath with care. And because you're altering that pattern in the microcosm, scale and variance means that that same pattern begins to be altered in the broad forum of your life. And suddenly you find that you're more gentle with your loved one, that you're more gentle with yourself, that you distract yourself less on the wide scope of your life. And this was why meditation is not some selfish thing, but rather a concrete way to sculpt our behavior and our perceptions in a controlled, careful way. And this is significant because when we look at causes and conditions, this first use of appropriate attention, when we learn the causes and conditions that play into these small patterns, and they're just easier to see when you're meditating, we can alter them in the large scope of our life as well. You see how, breaking your morality, saying something you shouldn't have the day before, keeps you from becoming calm during a meditation. And so you begin to understand the impact that has on your heart in the scope of your entire life. You can see how these conditions influence things and the connections more and more clearly because you have that form of meditation. And so you can see and influence those same patterns in the scope of your life. You see how beginning to inhabit and become comfortable with the body, or slowing down your breath when you have that tightness of anger arise in meditation, can calm those same mental patterns. And so when that same anger comes up in your life, you can release it by coming back to the body, by slowing down your breath when the argument begins. As Ajahn Sucitto says, when you feel the need to power up for anger, you power up right down into your feet. The other significant thing is there's something in the human heart, this insight into the dependently originated nature, the conditioned nature of our experience, how we're surrounded by this sea of shifting conditions, was at the heart of the Buddha's enlightenment. His understanding of this was what he pointed to as the key insight on the night of his awakening. And there's something powerful there, because when we understand how the world comes to be, the more we understand that, the less it feels wrong, the less we shoot ourselves with the proverbial second arrow of the extra suffering, that extra layer of feeling like things shouldn't be this way. Because there's something in the heart which is large enough to hold the world and all of its imperfection, if we understand how it, to some extent, became like that. And a really good example of this is, that classic experience where you have someone in your life who you just don't get along with. And then you learn their childhood, or you learn what's going on at home for them. And suddenly there's that enormous release in the heart where you say, oh, of course it's like that. And with ourselves, when, just that small thing where you don't know why you're grumpy, and then you realize, oh, I didn't get much sleep, or I haven't eaten breakfast. And there's just that sense of, because you understand the condition, what conditions gave rise to something, it's okay. The heart's big enough to hold that without suffering and without thinking it's wrong. Like Longpo Sumedho says, it's like this. And on a deep level, that can come down to our most fundamental and brutal imperfections. Understanding why we continue to play out these patterns in our lives and actions and relationships that we know are painful and damaging, by seeing how they came to be, and understanding that we, say, try to control the people around us because when we were a kid, maybe we had no control over the family that we lived in, or we had a parent or a sibling who was untethered, and so we found the need to try to control every other aspect of our life. And understanding that many of these neurotic and difficult parts of ourselves are just survival mechanisms left over from childhood. And meditation allows us to see those connections more and more. And when we see them, then we can hold that all with a great deal of love, and say to those same patterns, that same frightened or controlling child in us, thank you for helping me survive. I don't need you anymore. And you can put it on the shelf. And even if we don't understand exactly where a lot of this came from, somehow understanding that the cause of all of our neuroses is this fundamental ignorance that we all come into being with, allows us to hold the world with that same forgiveness and breadth of heart, understanding and looking at things in terms of the same causes and conditions. Because at the heart of it, all of it comes from a fundamental ignorance and suffering. That's what binds us all. And if we don't understand exactly where our own neuroses and suffering comes from, it can actually be still enough just to know that much, that, some teachers give the example of, you are carrying a bag of groceries and someone bumps into you and you drop them. And there's that immediate sense of anger. And then you turn around and realize that the other person is blind. And suddenly there's that enormous forgiveness in the heart immediately. So just to realize that we're all a bunch of people in the supermarket blindly wandering around, bumping into each other, is a great relief, because, we're all kind of in that game together. And at its heart, that's an understanding of conditionality. That's the primary condition for samsara, is ignorance and craving and suffering. And if we just see that much, then the heart paradoxically touches the transcendent, where it can hold all of that imperfection in perfect equanimity and love. And it can look on that at the sort of tragic comedy with that same compassion. And that's what the enlightened beings do. The next use of appropriate attention is to look at things in terms of their component parts. And for all of those of you, probably most of you who are familiar with the Theravada, you know that we have a deep love of lists, and the Buddha did. And these lists fundamentally are a parsing out of experience into more and more refined categories. And there's a lot of overlaps. The Buddha gave so many ways of parsing out experience. We have the 5 aggregates of experience, namely the body, feelings, perception, volitional formations, consciousness, or he gives you a way of breaking down experience into the 6 sense bases, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, touch, mental objects. He gives us a way of breaking experience into the 4 noble truths, the truth of suffering, its cause, cessation, and the path leading to its cessation. You'll notice that those 3 categories alone of the khandhas, the sense bases, and the 4 noble truths compose the first 3 of the Buddha's sermons, his seminal discourses, because they were such powerful modes of categorizing experience. He held them up in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in the Anatalakkhana Sutta, and the Aditapariyaya Sutta. And different ways of these categories will feel right at different times and help us put down suffering and see deeply into our experience. So you just have to, the more listed of these lists you learn, I mean, they can be a lot to metabolize at first, but it comes in handy over time. And you'll find that certain ones really ring true. Sometimes it's very useful just to know that the world, with all of its complexity and craziness, is really just 6 things. It's just sights, sounds, tastes, touches. And can that be enough? When things get complicated, we just come back to that. And meditation's a training in that, to an extent, is are you able just to come back to the breath, to the body, to the simple basic experience here? And if you become focused too much on one of those mental bases, like, or one of those sense bases, like mental objects, a fantasy, or some particularly difficult piece of mental proliferation, one teacher recommends just saying, what else is true right now? And just opening the other sense bases. Listen to the bird song outside, feel your body, feel your feet touching the ground. So looking at things in the component parts not only allows us to divide experience, but it also lets us not become too fixated on one part of experience. But it also really, and then sometimes looking at things in terms of the 4 noble truths, seeing where the suffering is. If you do get caught into, say, skeptical doubt around, the Buddha's cure for doubt was, or skeptical, unhealthy doubt, was to look at the quality of the mind, was to come to a calming object and then look at the quality of the mind, which is basically looking at the mind in terms of the Four Noble Truths. So instead of trying to parse out the same problem you've been running over in your head for the last hour, just look at how it feels to be caught in doubt. Look at the suffering of it and just label it dukkha, because you're not going to solve it from that mind state of doubt. You never do. So just see it as suffering. And then when you see it as that much and let go, then in that moment of quiet and calm, a solution frequently does arise. I also find it's helpful to come to those questions right after you wake up when the mind's calm. And dividing things into its component parts is useful for other reasons. It allows us to divide up other things. So for example, the Buddha gives 4 types of attachment, upadana: attachment to rites and rituals, to sensual craving, to views, and to self. So sometimes I found a very powerful tool for me is when anger arises, to see which of those ways of attaching is being challenged. So it's dividing up that attachment into its component parts and using that to see more deeply into the experience. So an example one could use on this is, if a junior monk cuts in front of me in the food line, and if you want to get monks kind of, if you want to sow discord in a monastery, this is a sure way to do it, I guess. But, and takes the donut that I was looking at or something. Am I angry because of attachments to rights to sensual desire? Did I just want the donut? Am I angry because my attachment to rites and rituals is being challenged? How dare they? I'm senior. This is how we do things. Am I angry because my sense of self is being challenged? Where it would be something like, of course they cut in front of me. No one ever respects me. They don't respect me. I'm worthless. Am I angry because of my views are being challenged, my attachment to views? They don't understand the importance of this tradition of how we do things. And just knowing that much, dividing it out, can be so helpful. It allows us to refine our attention in terms of the people we interact with. Because instead of looking at them in terms of individuals, just as unified entities, we can look at them in terms of their bright and dark aspects. And this lets us separate out things a bit, where we understand that we're all a mix. And instead of seeing someone behave badly and damning them for it, we can acknowledge that we're a mix of the animal and the angel. And this is the dark side of someone. And it also lets us see which side of someone we're feeding. Which are we actually being friends to? And this is significant on the path, because as we practice, we do step away from some people in our lives a little bit. And we step out of we decline to go out to the movie because we'd rather stay at home meditating. And people can be hurt by that and annoyed and not understand it. And it's useful to remember that the part of them that wants to go to the movie and have someone to do it with, it's fine, but that's not the part of them that, as practitioners, we have a responsibility to care for. Because there's another part of them that might be dormant right then, but that someday might encounter tragedy and might need to know that someone in their life represents a path and a transcendence and practice. And by stepping out of the usual dinner date, or by pulling in, by stepping farther on this path of practice, even if it means for a time, maybe not being as close to them, you're being a deep friend and ally to that deepest part of them. And that's a very salient reflection for monks. People are not always happy when you run away across the ocean. And yet, over time, you come back home and you realize that some people suddenly, cancer comes, or they lose a loved one, or divorce happens. And the fact that someone in their life represents to an extent a path beyond this conditioned realm and these mundane goals is the largest gift you could have ever given them. So, because people do not need another dinner date, but they do need someone to represent something else in their lives. And it also means that when you don't listen to the friend who's going to vent or gossip again and pull back a bit from that, it's okay, because all you're doing is deciding that you don't want to feed that part of them. So looking at people in terms of their component parts allows you to be much more careful and kind and brave in which part of them you're supporting and which part you're not supporting. And just as it allows you that freedom with them, it allows us to look at our own good qualities, not as these things that we own, but as bright gifts that were given to us by others, that we have the responsibility to care for and to pass on to those around us. Our brightness is a gift and something that we have the responsibility to steward. And that goes through this practice and these teachings. We don't come across these and have the luxury of holding them carelessly. They are a great blessing and a great responsibility. We have to steward them. And there is no larger duty in life than that, because people need so badly the Dhamma. And if it's been given into our hands, then can we acknowledge how important that is and carry it forward to those around us? Because at the heart of it, this path is not just for us, it's for the world. And that's how we have to conceive of our duty as practitioners. So I think that's plenty for now. I think we got another 8 uses to go through, but this talk was okay in terms of actually, maybe talking a bit about the broader scope of Yoniso Manasikara. So, yes.
Handamayang Dhammakataya Sadhu Karam Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami. So now we have an opportunity for questions. So, Nisabho, would you prefer people to raise their mechanical hand or to just unmute and speak out?
I'd be all right with unmuting and speaking out if people wanted. Although raising your mechanical hand will launch you to the front of the gallery, which might help everyone see you. So it could be good to do as well. That was a long talk. Sorry. It's a lot to cover.
So any questions
If
from the room? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
If I may, I'll ask a question. Nisabho, you mentioned the idea of breaking it apart into component parts. And I was curious if this is also a technique in a number of other ways to reduce greed by breaking it down into its component parts. May I ask why you chose that particular framework or that particular set of pieces of information to talk about for that particular use of wise attention? Thank you.
That's a great question, Nadine. And it's good to meet you, by the way. We may have met before, I'm not sure. But well, the three categories of the khandhas, the ayatana, and the Four Noble Truths are, those are just unbelievably powerful categories, which is why they are the first three sermons. I referenced upadana, those modes of attachment, just because it's one of those, it's a good example of a list that you wouldn't pay much attention to, but then you sort of bring it up, and at the right moment, it really does the trick, and so many of the lists are like that, but it's rather than being special, it's almost its lack of specialness, which is why I brought it up, because like you said, there's with greed, the different modes of craving the Buddha references, where you have craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, and craving for annihilation. That's just one more method of breaking stuff down. And each of these, you basically develop this tool belt. And those three are unbelievably useful, because sometimes, maybe you're binging on whatever because of craving for sensuality. Like maybe you really do, want to watch that 8 hours of Netflix season, whatever. But maybe it's actually craving for not becoming, maybe it's trying to annihilate yourself in a sense, of just shutting out experience. And, being able to parse, so that's just one more example of these ways that we're finding the articulation allows us to see much more deeply and tame it and understand it more. And also to address it. Like once we understand the sickness and the hunger a little better, we understand how to feed it a little better. So if it is craving for sensuality, that steers us towards Netflix, maybe we address that, by consciously, I don't know, going on a walk with someone or listening to some music, replacing that hunger with something that's a bit more healthy. But if it's craving for not becoming, maybe we need to look very carefully at what suffering is driving us to that. And so, yeah, the lists the Buddha gave, so many lists, but you gain a lot of appreciation, and you don't always know they're going to be relevant until later on. And it's one of the uses of really memorizing them, is that they'll come up in meditation and you'll be like, oh, that's useful. So yeah, I don't know if that answered that at all, but the Buddha divides up the pie in so many different ways, and what a great thing. So just going through the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical discourses, it's a lot of lists. Did that answer your question, Nadine, or is there more on it you'd like to speak of?
Sorry, you're having trouble seeing me. It was lovely. Thank you very much.
But another useful, just quickly, Gabrielle, before that, is one thing I did forget to mention is, one useful way of dividing experience into component parts is also the ability to temporally refine our awareness. So when you look at the breath, being able to track it more carefully between really seeing how that role of energy manifests in the body and the mind, and giving attention to the more refined parts of it. We tend to lose track of anapanasati at that moment between the exhale and the inhale. And if you really place awareness specifically there, trying to bridge that gap, not only, it's sort of, you're realizing that that's a part of the experience of the breath, but because it's the most refined part of the experience, if you're able to steer attention towards that more refined aspect, the mind refines as well, which is why Yoniso Manasikara is very much a way of refining our own hearts and awareness. Because what the breath becomes in that moment where there's no coarse wind is just energy. So if you really point awareness right there and try to keep aware of that bridge unbroken, then you become attuned much more to the energy of the breath separate from the actual breathing. And yeah, so that's also dividing things into component parts as well. And you could speak about it also in terms of the component parts of the body, where you're breathing, where you're moving the breath. There's a lot to be said. Gabrielle.
Thank you, Tan. There's so much just in this first talk. I'm at a point where I'm really trying to get a feel for bhava, that desire for becoming, but not in a way of certs and accomplishments in the world, but within, around what's the next thing I'm going to do, because I find there's a lot of restlessness that I deal with in trying to sit quietly. I can physically do it, but mentally I'm just all over the place. And it's, I'm either explaining, I'm either advising, or I'm thinking of the next thing. And I'm just wondering if you have some suggestions on how to deal with that, but also to understand some more of the refined aspects of this becoming. Thank you.
Great question. There's another list of what are called the nutriments for awareness, and they include contact, intention, and consciousness. So this is what kind of our supports for the mind and consciousness and the mind are. What's significant is that when you step into meditation, you're cutting off the nutriment of contact almost completely. You're closing your eyes, it's quiet. And we usually exist largely, the mind is feeding constantly. They're called the nutriments for a reason. It's feeding on this contact in the daily, life. So you suddenly take that away, and what's really left is the other nutriment of intention, which is what all these fantasies and becoming really are. Which is why when you step into meditation, the mind just begins to churn out fantasies like crazy, and proliferation and becoming, because you've cut off its food. All it has for in that moment is, it's trying to feed itself, and it's leaning on the nutriment of intention, and which is basically becoming. And this is, first of all, it's useful to work with, just to acknowledge that we're like karma creating creatures, especially in modern society. Like my teacher Ajahn would say that his Western students tended to think twice as much as his Thai students. I think to their detriment, and that it's a really big problem with how mindfulness of breathing was brought to the West. Is the instructions are so often just, put your awareness on the nose and just try not to control it, which is a bit like telling the analogy I use is, taking this classroom of screaming second graders and telling them to like sit down and take a test. And they've got all this energy, like you're just coming off of the day and a good, 50 years of proliferating, and you're just told to suddenly be quiet. So it's much better to let those second graders run around outside for a while in a wholesome activity, collecting stuff from the pond or doing a team builder, and then bring them in to sit down. So that's where really active techniques of working with the breath, like a lot of these can be found in Ajahn Thanissharo's talks, Ajahn Sucitto's talks, Ajahn Thanissharo's book, Keeping the Breath in Mind, or With Each and Every Breath, which all can be found on dhammatalks.org, although any of his talks go into this, which are all very active visualizations of ways of kind of moving awareness through the body, conceptualizing the breath as this light that moves through awareness, or even at the very least body scanning, which is what Goenka techniques largely use. This is where they come in handy, is you sort of you work with that controlling becoming energy to have fun with it. Like you play basically with the breath energy, you learn to become skilled with it. You learn, where you can kind of imagine the breath that feels nourishing. Ajahn Yanadamo talks about imagining breathing through his shoulder blades. I found that to be very helpful, actually, strangely enough. So it's useful to have this ethic of play, and that's a wholesome type of becoming, play. And it's also where these active techniques of, say, metta are, these sort of, the Buddha gave a lot of very active meditative techniques, like recollection of the triple gem, of one's goodness, which is all using that becoming energy until things quiet down enough that you can be with the breath simply. And as you begin to be with the breath and feel rapture arise, like this nourishing sense of well-being or this bright sense of love, suddenly the nutriment of contact is available again. So you are being fed suddenly by these bright states and these bright points of contact. And then that becoming energy can refine itself and let go a bit. And you need to churn out less of those proliferations and fantasies, because the mind doesn't need to feed itself with those anymore. It can feed itself with this bright contact. So that's what happens in the refined aspects of meditation. And just to finish this up, I know this is a lot, is that there's a dynamic in meditation called directed thought and evaluation, which is compared to ringing a bell and listening to its ring. And when we're applying these very active perceptions, say of, the, metta or moving the breath through the body, that's like ringing the bell. It's this becoming energy. We're dropping a perception into awareness very consciously. And then when you listen to that ring, when you feel how it feels, that's sort of the listening to it. That's the receptive quality that's gentle and refined. And just to acknowledge that as you move more and more into meditation, refine it, that you can listen to that ring for longer and longer. And you don't have to keep ringing the bell constantly. So, after a while, it's enough to just drop in a phrase of metta every 5 minutes and just listen to its glow. And you're basically refining that becoming energy little by little until eventually you don't need any of it. You can just rest in the ring as it kind of resounds. So that's a lot. One final thing, a useful way of directing the mind, but with less becoming energy, is to ask yourself questions and invite yourself. So say like, how can I be with the breath right now? What type of breath feels good? How can I let go of this? And then the chitta, the mind and the heart respond naturally. Instead of directing yourself, ask yourself a question. It's a gentle way of doing it. Sangamita, are we still on questions? What's the schedule?
Well, I just looked, I actually probably overscheduled us, so we've got tons of time.
We have another meditation session, right, at some point, or?
Um, well, like I'm just looking at my schedule here, so I'm wondering if I typed it out wrong, but I've got us all the way from 9:30 till noon for the talk and Q&A. So I think maybe I made a mistake.
In there, I had that there was this hour of meditation after my talk and then the Q&A, which would be a bit, perhaps, I think an hour and a half of Q&A would be a lot for me, but
Yes.
perhaps we could do we could go until 9:55 with the Q&A or 9:50, whatever, and then meditate for an hour before the meal. Would that be
Yeah.
workable, or what would you
Well,
like?
what I was thinking we could do is at 1:30, because we've been doing a lot of sitting, so I think some walking meditation would be good. And so when we finish the Q&A, let's do the 1:30 thing of you giving just a short description of walking meditation and answer any questions specifically on walking. And then we can have a break all the way till 2:30 Mountain Time, which is 1:30 your time, to sit or walk or and eat a meal. You know, and people can sort of figure out their own sort of timing in that space.
Okay, all right. So would that mean another 20 minutes of Q&A and then release into meditation slash all that openness schedule?
Sure.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. That sounds good to me. Yeah. And encouragement, that's a long gap. So if
Yeah.
people want to use that to maybe sit for a bit before they go into the meal, and just please continue practice as much as possible. Yeah. That sounds fine to me. Sangamita. But we can continue Q&A for a while then. Dhammika.
Bhante. My question regarding your last list that you were giving four things that we can address a hindrance. They seem to me they can intermingle. Like in one situation, we can have all four even.
Hmm.
How do you divide them and how do you address them when in a situation when you have hindrance? Thank you, Bhante.
Welcome. Do you mean specifically with the upadana, the craving or the attachments, or with the greed, or with any and all of them?
Where you mentioned about the self view, and then there are two more.
Donuts, that one?
That's right. Yeah, that's
Good, okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, they overlap, as many of these do. They're kind of Venn diagrams a bit. I don't always, sometimes it just helps to name the different aspects at play, to be honest, even if it's a bit of all of them that are in play. But sometimes there really is one that you didn't expect that's stronger. It's like, maybe you really don't care about the donut, but it is, and maybe even the sort of, system at the monastery is not a big deal, but it's more this sense that this person, it's that attachment to self, like this person doesn't respect me, no one respects me. And then, you bring up these memories from your childhood of people, looking down on you or whatever. And it helps to divide up the pie a bit. I think it's why the Buddha did it so much. So I think you have to play it by ear, but it's useful. And it's also useful in terms of, we work with these things as much as possible within ourselves. And there's real moments where it's good to have conversations with those around us about the issues we have with them, and to know what your needs are so that you can articulate clearly. That's very significant. So, with a loved one or a friend, like, if you're able to point to, like, it's not that you are going out a lot, it's that you don't talk to me about it when you get back, or you don't ask, like, being able to really pinpoint what your exact need is lets you demand less of the world, because you don't have to change everything as much. You can just change little bits, and that gives you a lot of agility in relationship, if you can work out solutions creatively. So, it's kind of like you're picking a lock with a lot of these things, but having a much better feel for the lock and the refined aspects of it lets you kind of be much more nimble, figuring out a way to exist with people and relationship in the world at peace, because you're able to figure out different ways of addressing specific needs and also of contemplating. So, yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, wait just a second. We have a question from the room here.
I can speak loudly if you'd like. Thank you for your talk. I have a question about, you had mentioned craving of not becoming or annihilation. How is this I guess, related to simplifying your life or trying to simplify things? Perhaps I'm not understanding the craving of not becoming and how it could be a bad thing. Obviously, annihilation, that sounds pretty bad, but that's my question, I guess, to summarize, is how are simplification and this craving of not becoming kind of interlinked?
Great question. Yeah, first of all, the Buddha was clear that craving has a place on this path, as does conceit. There's a sutta where he basically says, like, craving has a spot on the path where one thinks, one hears about an enlightened being and one thinks, oh, when will I too attain that deathless state? So, we do, it's okay to want to progress on this path, and to acknowledge that a lot of these impulses towards becoming a better meditator, a better person, towards simplifying and renouncing, which can have a quality of craving to not become, there's going to be a thread of these things within them initially, and that's okay. Like, it's just part of the landscape. We're flawed creatures. So, yeah, I think a lot of us have that experience of, seeing through a lot of the veil of the world and really being fed up with it suddenly, and really trying to step back, and it having a quality of aversion. And there's no perfect way around that except to kind of to look at it and just see the suffering in that, sort of the excess in that, because the move towards simplicity is an essential part of the Buddhist path. A lot of, it's impossible to keep good sila with so many balls in the air that we're juggling. Like, if you have too many relationships, then it's hard to care for them all well. If you have too many duties, it's hard to care for them. It's part of this beautiful minimalist movement, is if you get rid of items, like, you really do care for them more, and you can enjoy life more. Like Ajahn Amaro says, monks are the true hedonists, because things, you do savor things much more. And Meister Eckhart, the 12th century mystic, said, empty of things, full of God, full of things, empty of God. There's a reason the Desert Fathers lived in the desert. And so, yeah, the movement towards simplicity is good. Just watching as that asceticism is seeing where it's threaded with that sort of excess and where we're pushing too hard, and just refining that over time. It takes us a long time to refine our effort, and that's okay. But I think it is really important for Westerners to acknowledge that tendency towards really pretty brutal effort and really aggressive effort, and that really does become entwined with those movements of asceticism and renunciation very easily. And that's why it's so important in this tradition to hold up these things like refuges, like faith, to step into environments where that's very much supported, like monasteries, to meet teachers who embody the bright transcendent aspect, because we're only renouncing for the sake of opening our hands more to something else. But you've got to make sure that you're inviting in and raising up that other thing, of the Dhamma, of the transcendent, of the refuges. And so making sure you're balancing out and holding up that and rejoicing, it's a big deal. So that's where faith comes in a bit. So yeah, they're related. And I'd say that craving becomes unhealthy if it's over the top, and you just have to refine it and see it little by little. I hope that maybe answered the question a bit.
Yes, thank you.
Mary?
Hi, John. I was wondering if you could help me understand energy a little bit more. It's a term I'm not familiar with in my previous practice, and yet coming over to the Thai forest, I hear it a lot. And I don't, energy is hard to pin down. But I'm wondering if it has to do with what different mind states can propel within the body, the differences between like the energy of an agitated mind versus Brahma Vihara of metta or something. What do you refer to when you speak of this energy? Thank you.
Great question. When Ajahn Nisabho, Ajahn Suchito speak of, or Ajahn Lee speak of, the breath energy is actually how they refer to it. What they're speaking of is, anapanasati. Pana means breath, but it also means life force. And in the ancient conception, it wasn't just this coarse breath coming in and out of the nose, but it's prana in Sanskrit, chi in Taoist conception. And I think you could also think of it as, in its sort of movement aspect, it's what we refer to in Pali also as piti, P-I-T-I, rapture or refreshment is a good word for it, because piti is related to the word for drink, and it has this quality of refreshing and nourishing. So if one cultivates sort of that full-bodied breath awareness over time, you can become more and more aware of, say, this flow of the breath energy that sort of does run. Usually it's quite visible, or you can feel it more running up the spine and down the front of the body, or sometimes up the front of the body and down the spine, what are called the meridians. And if it's hard to feel, qigong can help a lot, as can cold showers, or these active techniques where Wim Hof. I think cold water is very helpful, but these active techniques of moving awareness through the body that are outlined by Ajahn Nisabho. Looking at mind states more is, that's more like the mind state itself, but it is related. And just to say, if one doesn't mesh, feel that energy, the breath energy, it's fine. Like, other bases of meditation are really completely appropriate. So if one is just enjoying being with the breath as it is, as you feel it at the nose, that's great. Or just that brightness of metta. I mean, that's a lovely energy that people do refer to as piti as well. And, it can be interesting to try out Qigong a little, or cold showers, especially if one finds that breath meditation is really kind of boring. Then getting up and doing some walking meditation, or a bit of Qigong, or a cold shower, or, just trying to track the breath more at that space between the breaths. You might begin to get a little of a feel for it, but it's also okay if that's just not in your experience. You shouldn't worry about it. Breath meditation can also be really simple if you're happy just following the breath naturally. That's great. Yeah. And those visualizations are helpful in getting a feel for it, around like imagining the breath as the body is a large bubble, and the breath is sort of this white mist coming in and out of it. You can imagine breathing in through the kidneys, through the shoulder blades, through the tailbone, through the crown of the head, and just, you don't have to imagine the breath coming in exactly in tandem with the inhale and exhale, but as you kind of breathe, keeping an image of that breath energy is sort of moving in and out at a rate that feels good. It can you might start feeling that sense of nourishing, and that's a good sign in terms of touching into this whole realm of the breath energy, or the pana. It's the wind energy.
Thank you. That clarifies it a lot. And I have touched on those, so it's helpful to know. Thank you.
I think we have about 5 more minutes. So
Nisabho, may I ask a follow-up question to that?
yeah, who are you? Where are you? Oh, maybe I see you now. Good. If you raise your actual hand, you'll pop up to the front, or your your electronic hand.
Virtual hand. Okay.
Sorry. But it's
yeah.
fine. I see you now. You can go for it.
Okay, good. And my other name is Bodhipala, which you'll probably recognize more. I'm at Birkin.
Great.
So my understanding is that when the Buddha defines energy as a factor of awakening, he pretty much gives the standard definition of right effort. So how would that fit into your way of thinking about this?
The translation into English is difficult. And it's really good you brought this up, because you're right. Like, energy is usually virya, which is the word the Buddha uses in that context, and a really important term. Yeah, it's right effort of, just for those who don't know, bringing into being or restraining unwholesome states that have not arisen from arising, abandoning unwholesome arisen states, bringing wholesome states that have not arisen into being, and strengthening wholesome states that have arisen. So that's, virya, which people translate as energy or effort. This would be the Pali words for what we're talking about here. I think breath energy would be maybe that's an important thing to just speak about it always, as breath energy, because it is referring specifically to the Pali word of pana, and to an extent to the Pali word for piti. They are different. I'd say they're just related in that one puts forth effort to cultivate these states, even if it's just the effort to become sensitive to something. And that when one kind of begins to access these say, the breath energy a little more, or this sense of well-being, it's exciting and can be very interesting, and that can make one put forth more effort. It's a nice feedback loop. And also to say that some people don't wirya, this right effort doesn't always just have to manifest on the cushion. Like sometimes if you're sitting and things are stale, it's really worth getting up and doing some walking, or, you know, doing some qigong, something like that, or yoga. So yeah, good question. I think we have time for one more question if people have something. And okay. Well, I believe that Sangamita had mentioned if people want to ask anything about walking meditation, I can also give a brief explanation, or Sangamita, you'd be welcome to as well.
Yeah, I invite you to just give a brief explanation of walking and then just see if there's any clarification questions.
So yeah, it's walking meditation is a really nice aspect of our tradition. The Buddha praised it, and he did a lot of walking. So, and some monks, you know, this is their main practice. They'll do walking meditation for 8 hours a day or so. So it's not to be looked down on, and the concentration you gain from it's really strong. So you basically find a straight area, 20 paces or so is a good distance, but it's however far you have, and cross your hands in front of you, not behind you, that's too casual, but in front of you, and keep your gaze about 3 feet or so in front of your walking, and just walk at a maybe slightly slower than normal pace, but it doesn't have to be sort of the Burmese way of like super, super slow walking. If you don't want it to be, it can be fairly normal. And you walk to the end of the path, you pause, turn around, and walk to the other end. And Ajahn Chah would always stress checking yourself at each of those ends of the path and in the middle, to just say, where's your mindfulness right now? You know, just check in each of those places. Those are your anchors. And you can, if you're using this sort of full body breath technique, you can just continue with that, imagining the breath energy kind of flowing up and down, that's fine. Or tracking the breath at the nose, that's okay. However, if you want to just remain with the sensation of the feet hitting the ground, especially in tandem with a mantra like love, love, Buddha, Buddha, awake, awake, whatever feels right, then that's fine too. And the idea is sort of just to be with that experience of walking. If you do this for a time, or you can cultivate loving kindness as you do it, but over time, the mind will become calmer. And when you feel kind of like you've really are ready to sit, then just sit. It leads very well into sitting. It dovetails and alternates perfectly. And you can even experiment really pushing it and just walking meditation until your mind becomes so calm it can't walk anymore, and you just have to stand, and then you sit. So yeah, any questions on the basics of it? So yeah, I think that Sangamita, you can correct me with the schedule, but I think we, well, actually, Sangamita, please, you can fill people in.
Yeah, well, I think I made a mistake here when I was setting up the schedule. So either we could come back right at noon Mountain Time and 11 o'clock your time for a meal blessing and then the meal, or we could just decide to come back just before your Dhamma talk at 2:30 Mountain Time, 1:30 your time.
I'd be happy to, I like having I think we've had a lot of talk, so I'd like the idea of keeping people's cameras on as much as they want for the next hour, but people having permission to walk for a bit and sit, I certainly will. And then we could break for the meal at 11. Do you think that's appropriate? I mean, 12 Mountain Time.
Yeah. Okay, so we have like 58 minutes to either do sitting or walking or a combination. And then we will all be back here at 12 or 11, depending on our time zone, for the meal reflection. Okay,
Thank you all.
thank you.